Hey, welcome to all of you who join us live on YouTube. This is a Brazilian Shirt Name podcast, a weekly podcast, of course, been going on now for almost 5 years. Great to have you on YouTube. You can also download the podcast, of course, anytime during the course of the week. As ever, Tim Vickery has got his chest exposed.
The long hot summer hasn't passed me by. On and on it goes, and let it go on until the calendar says stop, Daddy-o.
And you heard that laughter, didn't you? You heard that laughter all the way from Caledonia, from a porter cabin in Caledonia. We've got one of our old friends and absolutely friend to the podcast as well, of the Scottish Herald, amongst other papers. The great Hugh MacDonald, football writer and columnist, is with us. Good morning, Hugh. Oh, good morning, I say.
Hi, this is it's not so much we're in a time lapse up here. It's more like welcome to the 19th century up here, where I'm sitting in the freezing cold as I look at Mr. Vickery. You know, and literally, Tim, I had to go. It's almost March. Literally this morning, I had to clear the. I kid you not, before doing the school run for my grandchildren, I must say, I had to clear the ice off my car.
There you go. And why you're living in a porter cabin is up to you to tell listeners if you so wish. But there you go. There you go. No, Hugh, honestly, it's a pleasure to welcome you onto this Brazilian Shirt Name podcast because, as you know, we always look at an iconic game from some time in the football in the past and try and talk about it in retrospect, but also to look at the times and the circumstances and the cultural landscape. And today, I think it's long overdue that we talk about perhaps the greatest Scottish football brain. How do you want to describe Jock Stein, the late great?
Yeah, I would. Not only that, I would say, I would say the sort of one of the great Scottish football revolutionaries, and certainly the man whose influence continues on to this day, and perhaps not only in Scottish football, but in European football, because in '67, when Celtic won the European Cup, European football was at a real crossroads, and where would it go? And people thought the most likely we would go would be under another great manager, maybe of a more sinister hue in Helenio Herrera, and would his Catenaccio be the way that football would go? And the odds seemed pretty much on that. And instead, Stein came out in '67 with this very, very attacking style of play. Two fullbacks very far up the pitch, almost very modern. It's a game, by the way, if you watch football back, old football can seem a bit outdated. That game, which I had to watch not long ago, it stands up very well for Celtic in terms of dynamism and tactics. So he made that he made that a very viable alternative route to go down. And every Dutch manager of total football, which came in the early '70s as a success, and Stein actually was one of its victims in 1970 in Milan. That's another story. It was very much influenced by that day in Lisbon, May 25, 1967.
I was 2 years old that very day, the day I turned 2. Thinking about Jock Stein, and there's two things that really strike home to me. One is we down in England, we never really knew him. Mm-hmm. He's yours, and he spent a few weeks in charge of Leeds, and then the Scotland job came, but we never knew him. We knew Busby and and Shankly and Ferguson and so on, but Stein we didn't know. And
we did know of him, though. We did know of him.
Yeah, but we don't really know him in the same way. And the thing that just blew my mind, because I remember this game like it was yesterday. I remember it really clearly. He was 62. I thought he was like 120 or something. The grand old man. He was 62 for crying out loud.
Do you know something, Tim? For all my immersion in Stein's life and the detail of it, and talking and interviewing literally dozens of people, scores of people who knew him or worked with him or revered him. When I was going back and doing my revision in preparation for this, I was stunned by that as well. I knew it, But I was stunned by it. But I think it's because when it happened, he had that sort of feeling of sort of an eminence grise, shall we say. He'd already been discarded by Celtic, and that's what he was. And in those days, the managerial job at a national, certainly, and I would say the British Isles, was looked at almost a top up to your pension, or to, you know, it was after you'd really done well in the club game, instead of a gold watch, so you get the national team, you know. And I thought 62, it just, I mean, I knew it, but it's funny you mentioned that as kickoff, because it really resonated with me last night.
Yeah, I'm not surprised it resonates because of the way that this whole game turns out off pitch as well as on the pitch. 1st of September 1985 is the game we're looking at. Wales versus Scotland.
10th of September.
Oh, apologies. 10th of September 1985 is what we're looking for. Wales versus Scotland. It's at Ninian Park, which was Cardiff's home ground, I seem to remember. Yep. And this is a World Cup qualifier, so there's a lot to play for, a lot of tension. We'll talk about the match in a moment or two. I think it's appropriate because a lot of people will know what happens because, as you often say, Tim, sometimes, you know, the real world is much bigger than football. You know, football is only a small portion of, you know, the real lives that people enjoy.
Of all the unimportant things in the world,
that's the one you do. Yeah,
it's the most important.
I could not remember exactly the quote, but thank you for that. Jock Stein literally dies with his football boots on before the end of this match. Hugh, 62 is no age whatsoever nowadays, but you know, we're going back 40 years or so, and 62 perhaps. Even then, it would have been very young, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would be. So it's funny because it'd be sort of premature. My grandfather, whose only trip to Europe, the only time he'd ever put his foot in European soil was in 1967 when he went to see Celtic win under Stein at Lisbon. He died at 62, just shortly after that. By the way, he didn't survive a year from the European Cup. And I remember as a kid thinking, well, yeah, he's an old man, and 62 is what you get. And a few years ago, we went to his gravesite. We cleaned up his gravesite and his gravestone. And when I saw the 62 at the end of that sentence, I went, oh my goodness, because I was already beyond that and not thinking of checking out. But yeah, I mean, what Stein's in that era, and Stein was at the end of that era, and it was still premature. There was a lot of indigenous Scottish illnesses which have continued to this day, and one of them is heart disease. And Stein, of course, Stein, of course, would be looked upon one of the most healthy people around because his only real obsession outside football was having a bet. He wasn't a smoker, and he was teetotal, completely teetotal.
Wow.
But he'd obviously got these heart problems, and it's strange in the build-up to the game when people have become friendly with many people actually played in the game. Notably Alan Ruff, who came on from a half time, and we'll get to that later. But they say there was some of the vim and vigour of Stein in the build-up to that game. They were actually mentioning it amongst the teammates. He looked pale, he looked tired. For him, there was very little energy in it. There was also a suggestion that he was taking pills, diuretics, to help. He had a heart condition. And he hadn't taken them that day because he knew he'd be sitting on the touchline for up to 2 hours. Well, 2 bouts of 45 minutes. And diuretics, of course, make you want to go to the toilet. So he thought, well, I'm not going to sit, needing to go to the toilet on the bench, so I'm not going to take my diuretics. This was quite a common sort of, thing, talking to people who were there on the day that Stein had told him I'm not taking my medication, and that he did look unwell. And then you add on the incredible stress of you've got to avoid defeat to go to a World Cup at a time when Scotland were serial World Cup qualifiers. So there wasn't just hope that we'd go to the World Cup. There was extraordinary expectation that we would be going there.
Was he, by this stage, Hugh, was he past his best? And is Stein in this, you mentioned 67, and he's ahead of the curve in 67. And then football develops very, very quickly. Have we seen the best of Stein?
I think the best of Stein absolutely would be. They talk about 67. I think one of the great Stein eras. I think the 1970 team might have been in this. Hush it and hope that nobody in Glasgow. I'll speak this silently so nobody in Glasgow hears it. I think the 1970 team was as good as the Lions. You know, the team that beat Leeds home and away. You know, so. It continued into the 70s. I think after he left Celtic, and it seems remarkable now, but that was the way of football. We know it. It happened to Ramsey, it happened to everybody. No matter what you do, you get shoved aside, don't you? I think after he was basically dismissed with Celtic or shoved aside, he was offered a very almost insulting administrative job. I think he diminished after that. And the great thing, the huge thing about Stein, which is not mentioned too often in connection with the Hartnells, he survived a catastrophic car crash. He actually had Archie Macpherson, the great Scottish commentator, who was a huge friend of Stein and travelled with Stein all over the world, tells of a plane journey with Stein, where Stein is sitting in this long plane. They're going out on a scouting trip to New Zealand, I think, to watch national team play. And Stein tells the story of how he had this near-death experience in the car crash, that he thought he had died and had come back. So goodness knows what that happens to the psyche and the motivation, etc., etc., etc.
What do you think his secret was? I mean, all of those magnificent Scottish managers, they're all leaders of a community. They're all fantastic at that, but they're all different as well. I mean, Busby, I see Busby as the man with an idea. He's got a very clear idea of what he wants to do with Manchester United. Great industrial city. We are going to be glamorous. We're going to be attacking. We are going to provide the colour. Shankly is just an absolute motivational force of nature. Ferguson is intelligent enough to be a chameleon, and also this force of nature personality. What was Stein's secret?
I think Stein is closest, or Alec is closest to Stein in terms of what the strong side. If you ask Alec Ferguson what his great attributes are, he will reply quite honestly, he'll say, I'm lucky. You know, it's true. We know about football, and he says it. He says, but also have a great constitution. I can get up at 7:30 in the morning and I'm ready to go to my work. And there's a bit of that with Stein, but I think with Alec and Stein, and they would be too humble to say it, I think Michael Vanny's great, who knew both of them really well. And actually, Hugh Michael Vanny, who one of the joys of my life, who I came to know really well, and become a very close friend of, he wasn't impressed by many. You know, he had due respect for a lot of people. But he bowed to Stein. He really did. And he said of Stein, great Michael Vanny phrase, Stein had a ferocious intelligence. A ferocious intelligence. And that's what Alec has as well. Alec's a smart man. And actually learned a lot. We'll maybe talk about that later. Learned so much from Stein. But I think Stein's greatest attribute was his intelligence. It's what he got by on as a footballer. As a footballer, he was slow. He was one-paced. He wasn't as aggressive as centre-halves in those days. He was aggressive enough, but not as aggressive as centre-halves in those days could be. But he had the brain to be in the right place at the right time. He had the brain to know what he could do and what he couldn't do. Anthony McPherson actually believes that his ankle injury, which he carried on throughout his life, that famous limp that they had, if anybody ever saw him, Anthony McPherson believes that he broke it in a mining accident and covered it up for all his professional career. He actually played injured for all his years, and I'll not go into the detail, but he's got newspaper cuttings that make this seem, really credible. But I think it was Stein's intelligence, and then after that, there's vision, there's will, and what links him with other Scottish managers, and it's probably, you're right, they're disparate personalities, is this very socialist background, particularly mining. They all came from mining communities. Alec, of course, was more shipyard. The other three were mining communities. And it was this almost in the DNA, almost accepted of the team, of the whole. You're working with guys that could
your life depends on the fellows that you're working with.
Yeah,
was he a ranter, like, you know, Ferguson's famous hairdryer thing?
Yeah.
Would Stein do that, or was he more relaxed?
No, Stein there was genuine fear in the Celtic dressing room on Stein. You did not want to get in the wrong side of Stein. He could be physical. It was a wonderful occasion when Jimmy Johnson, his most mercurial and probably, certainly, very influential figure, he either was sent off or Stein substituted, and he was going down the tunnel. He said something to Stein, and Stein had this very unusual gait, as I said, the bad leg, and Stein jumped out the tunnel to go after him, and you'd never seen Johnston go so fast. He overtook Jesse Owens on the way to the dressing room, and all Olympic hopefuls, and caused the dressing room and sort of under siege. No, there was a physical fear about Stein. Actually, it's interesting. I did a long interview with Alec Ferguson on Stein. I think it was the 50th anniversary of Lisbon. And Alec, as you would imagine, was hugely informative about Stein. And he said the only thing he didn't take from Stein was Stein had recommended to him that after the game, leave everything to the Monday or the next day. Don't rant at your players after a game because it causes problems, you're emotional. And Alex, that's the only thing I couldn't do. He said, I had to get it out on the day. And the next day it could be clear. But Stein was, he said, don't do it there. But there's so many occasions of talking to great players about what he said sort of dryly after a game that made sure that they knew what they'd done, good or ill.
On this game, or in this game of the 10th of September 1985, Wales versus Scotland, as you've already alluded to, Scotland had to not lose this match. So how did Jock Stein set his team up, the Scottish team, national team then, to not lose the match against Wales?
Well, he was a great man. It probably diminished slightly by this time because it was the national team and it wouldn't have his complete imprint. But Stein was always a great man for the best, the cliche, the best way to defend is to attack. And really, in the clutch situations, that's what he did in life. If you, even he's probably club level, his biggest disappointment would be playing against Feyenoord. And Celtic played a 4-2-4 and got overrun in midfield. And the Feyenoord three, Hannigan, Janssen, and I think it was Israel. Kinval. They overran him in midfield, and Celtic lost that game. But that was going 4-2-4, but he would always go on the front foot. So although that would be slightly compromised in the international, he would be going all out to win. He wouldn't be, like an Italian manager, for example, saying, well, let's go there, play Catenaccio or play, sweeper. hit them on the break, etc., etc. So it was an attacking lineup. It was a lineup picked to win the game.
And
but
yet
with
they
a lot
struggle.
of people out, a lot of injuries.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no
point.
Dalglish. There's no Souness. Although I wonder if Souness had gone by this stage. I remember when they did qualify for the World Cup in '86, Souness was poor, wasn't he? Was very poor, and ended up losing his place to McStay.
Yeah, and Alec didn't ended up. I think Alec played him in the last game against Uruguay, and he did lose his place. And Souness in later life always wondered if that was he did feel in Mexico that he wasn't as vibrant, he wasn't as energetic, and he put it down to altitude, etc. And he wondered in later life if it was just the first intimations of his heart problems,
right?
Which were genetic seemed to be genetic because his father had the same thing. And Souness later wondered, was that was that the problem rather than any loss of form? But of course, Scotland were. I mean, we were still a very strong and good team, and a team that you would. Wales as well was strong, obviously, but a team that you would expect to go down to Wales and win.
Hughes and Rush.
Exactly, good team. I mean, yeah. I mean, the home nations at that time, had. We use the word quite loosely now, but they did have players that could be described as world class. And Hughes and Rush.
Yeah, I think there's 4 in the Welsh side because you've got Southall and Kevin Ratcliffe as well. So I think you got 4. A lot of journeymen, a lot of like good honest pros, but you got a spine there of 4 world class players in the Welsh side. I know this is dwarfed by events and the way that the game ended, but I feel very sorry for Wales in this game. I think they got. I mean, especially after the '78, the qualifier in '77 when Joe Jordan handles the ball, and the ref bizarrely thinks it's a Welsh defender, and Scotland get the penalty that sends them through and sends Wales out. For Wales to get done in a similar way, I think is very unfortunate.
I think so too. I bore. I must admit, on both occasions, I bore up well under the injustice of that. I managed to. My shoulders were broad enough to take.
Well done.
To take the angst of that and go on. But two very, I think, very generous decisions. And again, I agree with you. The Wales side. I mean, international teams at that time, Wales and Scotland, would have 3 or 4 really top class players, but a lot of the journeymen, were English in those days first division players. They were good. I mean, your ass, etc., etc. They were time served, as it were. The expression we had up here. They knew what it was about.
But it was handball, wasn't it? The Welsh. The Scottish. Well, that's given away the ending. It ends up in a draw. Okay, we know that ends up in a draw.
They're running out of time. Out of time. Wales have taken the lead early.
But it was a handball, wasn't it? And you know what the rules of the game are?
But it's from 2 yards. I mean, it will be harsh now, but then there weren't a lot of handballs like that given.
I actually thought it was the goalie. It was so blatant. I thought it was the goalie that handled the ball. But anyway, it's in the penalty area, and it's a penalty. Before that, though, and you mentioned Mark Hughes earlier on, it's almost as if Scotland forgot that Mark Hughes was in their penalty box for the Welsh goal, because he's left totally unmarked. I mean, they put 2 defenders on the winger who manages to get away, slip through with the ball nevertheless, and pass it straight to Mark. There's nobody between, and given that the winger is passing the ball from outside the penalty area on the left wing, there's nobody between him and the centre spot, the penalty spot where Mark Hughes is waiting to, and it's a good goal from Mark Hughes, but it's like, what on earth was Scotland thinking? If they were supposed to not lose, they weren't, they didn't get the memo.
Yeah, I think though, as one who goes down these rabbit holes of YouTube and looks at old games and old goals, the one thing about modern football, and they say, oh, they can't defend nowadays. What they can do, of course, is they're much more aware of spatial movement and where. I mean, you know all the stories about managers, training people without the ball, so that they're marking space, whether it be zonal or facing up to a midfield, they're marking space all the time. There was an element I noticed a lot of goals where people just got lost in the frenetic chaos of a game, and suddenly you would have, by some kind of like chaos theory, you would have Mark Hughes suffering from agoraphobia in the middle of a box. That's suddenly said getting this existential "I am legend" angst, saying, "Am I the only person left alive in the world?" Oh, there's a ball. Oh, there's a goalkeeper. Some kind of muscle memory kicks in and he hits it past him. But that is one. I mean, we could do a whole show on space in football, because one of the things you notice about football now is like players obviously are players are all athletes now. Every one of them's an athlete. So obviously the pitch is smaller than it's ever been before. Switches up because they can cover. If every player's doing 12 kilometres when they're on the park, pitch is a very small thing.
I'm fascinated. It's a piece of info I got from the former fellow who used to be Brazil's physical preparation specialist. Between the mid-70s and the mid-90s, the average amount of ground covered by top-level footballers doubles.
Yeah.
That makes it a different game.
Absolutely.
And that is the Maradona era, from the mid-70s to the mid-90s. But until it's too late for Maradona, really, until after the 1990 World Cup, there's no extra protection from the referees.
No.
It's one of the reasons for the greatness of Maradona. He's doing it at a time when the defenders are more athletic. They can do whatever they like to him, and there's no protection.
And they all get one free. Everybody gets one free. You get a red card offence for nothing. You just pick up your get out of jail card, and the referee. There's the great video of Maradona in the World Cup '82 winning against Italy, just getting leathered, and then the great England game where everybody accuses Maradona of cheating, and you say, well, out of all the cheats that were on the park that day, Maradona was the least, because all he did was punch the ball in his hand. He didn't assault people. He didn't go around
elbowing his face off the ball.
People kicking him when he wasn't on the ball, etc., etc. But it is noticeable to wind the way around to round the way around that space was. You see it in rugby as well, nowadays. There's no space in a rugby pitch now. Remember the old days, you saw all the rugby players running about, helter-skelter, passing them. There's just nothing there. And it's because the pitch has to be smaller because guys can cover it better.
Yeah, well, it didn't do their athletic capability very well to drink so much aftershave, I think.
I'd say, yeah.
That was probably a problem.
Aftershave has never been described as a performance-enhancing drug.
We now come to the moment that, for me, is the most extraordinary thing until the death of Stein in the game. Which is, and as someone who at this stage had already been wearing contact lenses for 4 years.
At 2 years old? At 2 years old, you were wearing contact lenses for 4 years?
I started at 16 in 81. The Scotland goalkeeper, Jim Leighton, coming out for crosses and not being able to see it. And he has to confess that he's lost a contact lens. He doesn't have a spare. And the amazing thing is his club coach, Ferguson, is there. His club defenders are there. And none of them knew.
Yep.
I just find this unbelievable.
Well, so did Stein. Stein had shall we say, a robust exchange with Ali over that. And saying, has happened here. While all this is kicking off in the dressing room, where a guy says, well, I can't go back on the park because I've lost a contacts lens and my other set are somewhere in an Aberdeen postcode, some miles away. It becomes obvious that they have to bring on the substitute goalkeeper. The substitute goalkeeper, Alan Rough, is out on the turf. And Alan is a great friend of mine. And Alan tells a wonderful story about this, that he and David Speedy are out on the park, and given the rigorous discipline of the day and the rigorous adherence to preparation, they are kicking a ball across the park to each other, middle of a World Cup qualifier at half-time, trying to knock off the helmets of the Welsh Guards band that are walking up and down the park. And there's going to be points given to each of them as to as many helmets they could go.
Are they betting on this?
Yeah,
of course.
The loser's going to pay a bet for who knocks off the most helmets. This is in the middle of the most crucial game for the national team in at least 4 years, of course. But it's very emblematic of Ruffy, by the way. Very emblematic of Ruffy. So Ruffy's doing this, and Brian Scott, the physio, sprints onto the park and says, Ruffy, get inside, you're going on. Where Ruffy tells him to procreate elsewhere. Because there's no way that Steve's going to substitute a goalkeeper in the middle of a World Cup match. And Brian says, pleads with him to come in. And Ruffy's saying, I know. So Ruffy goes in, and the dressing room is in bedlam. Bedlam. And of course, Ruffy always says, when asked, about that night in Cardiff, is always asked, he said, Ruffy always says, well, I can always remember Stein's last words to me. And people will say to him, what were they? And it says, you're on, you fat.
This was his first game for Scotland since the '82 World Cup.
Yeah. But Ruffy being Ruffy, when I'm talking to him about this years later over a coffee in a restaurant, I'm actually having an incipient panic attack of my feelings, an anxiety dream. You're just dragged off and somebody told you are now in goals for the most important 45 minutes, and, for 5 years. And I said to Ruffy, well, what did you, couldn't even form the question. I'm going, what did you do? Ruffy? I just went out and played, just went out and I said fight, and got a jersey, put it on, walked out, and that was it. And that was it for Ruffy.
Well, amazing. It was
the effect of this on Stein. Is this the moment? Is this the moment that tips the balance?
Well, the theory is that the moment it tipped the balance came later. After the equaliser, he knows they know they're getting through, or they should get through for the result. There is an indication from some of the people present that Stein is in the dugout, and you remember in the old days, the dugout was literally a dugout, so you were looking up, or at least he was straining to look. It might have been fairly low. I can't remember precisely if the Cardiff fans dugout was, but anyway, he was straining, crouching to see the game, and a photographer came round to take his picture. At the end of the game to catch a reaction to Scotland. So Stein couldn't see the game, and Stein liked photographers in the way that old seafarers liked scurvy, that was
or in the way that Frank Sinatra had a liking for
photographers. Stein would think that Frank Sinatra's reactions to photographers were unduly lenient and passive. He did not like a photographer or a
It was always said about George Cohen, England's World Cup winning right back, that his crossing was so bad. They always went behind the goal. He hit more photographers than Frank Sinatra.
Well, Stein did not like a snapper, and in this occasion, he got up out the dugout and moved the guy physically aside. And people say that was maybe the ultimate tipping point. But if you had to come up with a whole series of events that precipitates or climaxes in a fatal heart attack, being 62 and having a heart condition would be one. Not taking your medicine would be second. Facing the greatest night in Scotland, the biggest night in Scottish football, and your goalkeeper comes in and says, I can't play the second half, and then having an argument would add to it. And then the sheer tension of trying to hold on to a result, which is always in the balance.
Well, the penalty as well. Let's not forget, that's tense enough, isn't it?
Yeah, and then
it's tense for us.
You've got to convert the penalty as well.
Who is this? I mean, this is another one that we didn't really know. Davy Cooper.
Well, Davy Cooper is huge in Scotland. Really huge. Davy Cooper would be, literal legendary figure in Scotland. And a legendary figure with, I think, 3 clubs in Scotland. Clydebank, Motherwell and Rangers. Now, he would be another man who died tragically young as well, Davy Cooper. And Davy would be a step back. And if people didn't know him as a player and knew John Robertson as a player, Davy would be in that mould. And that Davy would be a left winger, one-footed, very good dribbler, but not pacey. Davy was the kind of guy that would come back to beat a defender twice. He would just, defenders could recover and he would just beat them. But he was loved by supporters, certainly of those 3 clubs and certainly of the national team, because of that beauty of his game, how he could dribble and how he was an excellent striker of the ball, for example. His free kick collection is a top collection, his free kick collection. And as I say, loved at 3 clubs because of his exploits here. And of course, now a matter of great myth to the younger generation because they never saw him because of his premature death. I think of an aneurysm.
Yeah, I was going to say that even though Scotland do score that goal, Neville Southall almost gets to it. That's the point where I start to feel sorry for Wales because you feel like there ain't no justice, just us. He gets his finger to it.
It's especially sad as this Scotland generation. They'd had they'd been to the previous World Cup. They go to the World Cup afterwards and lose to Costa Rica. But the Welsh, great players in there. They never got the chance. So I do feel sorry for them.
But that was the other thing as well is the generation that people forget. That they say, why did Wales not qualify for the World Cup for canteen years, or why did when England had a good side and even after the 70s, England never qualified for World Cup. Why do Scotland? You always see Scotland to the greatest players in the world in the 60s, and they never got to a World Cup. The fact of the matter was the World Cup was a very hard thing to get to. It wasn't like runners-up and groups get.
Yeah.
It wasn't 16 teams from Europe going.
Yeah, England in 74 didn't go for this.
But this is because of Poland.
Against Poland, who come third. And England in 78 don't go because they lose the qualifying group on goal difference to Italy, who come fourth. So it's
go back to Scotland. Scotland in 62 don't go because they lose a playoff to Czechoslovakia. They lose a playoff when 4 of their top players, Baxter, Ian St. John, Dennis Law, etc., can't play in the playoff. And Czechoslovakia go to Chile and finish second.
Yeah.
When he runners up to the
for 70, I think they're in the same group as West Germany, weren't they, Scotland?
Exactly, and draw
And
with
one goes
West
through.
Germany, one each. I was at the game at Hampden, and lose 4-3 in Germany, where they were really unlucky. Really unlucky to lose to Germany 4-3, and at Hampden, they could have sneaked it that night as well. So it was tough to qualify for World Cups. It was brutal to be a European and trying to get to World Cups.
Yeah, I think you've hit much of the nail on the head in terms of the generational shift.
Yeah.
I was telling Tim, I think just last week or the week before, for my generation, who, I was 6 years old when England won the World Cup, we thought,
Yeah.
oh, this is how it's always going to be. It's always going to be like this, that England have got a right to the World Cup. But then for another generation that come, a decade or so later, suddenly it's not an entitlement anymore because they see how difficult it is. And I suspect that for younger generations tonight, as we speak, at least, Jock Stein falls between, expectations of the younger generation in terms of Scotland's achievements, either World Cup achievements or first British club to win the European Cup achievements with Celtic. That is just a little bit before the modern times. I wonder whether the resonance of Jock Stein is still being felt in Scotland in general. In Scottish football, I don't doubt that it is to some extent, because he was a manager for such long lengths of times at the clubs that he was at. But I wonder whether younger Scots football fans understand his achievements, if you like,
or understanding with the national team.
Yeah, I don't think they fully appreciate. One thing they certainly do is that the great McIlvanney recorded this it's just wonderful as a journalist, that when they won the European Cup in '67 in Lisbon, McIlvanney got into the dressing room immediately after the game with Bill Shankly. He was a great friend of Stein's, obviously, and a great friend of McIlvanney's. And Shankly gave the line, "John, you're immortal." Not Jock, John, you're immortal, right? And that is it. And he has been immortal. Because one of the things you'll find in social media in Scotland, you'll find it a lot, and you'll find it talking to it, and I've actually, of course, been to the ground, is that Lisbon is now a pilgrimage for generations of Celtic supporters. I mean, if you go up to the Stadio Nacional, if you go up tomorrow morning, say you went up, you were in Lisbon and you got a taxi out, or the beautiful train ride out to Cruz Campo, and then walk up the National Park to the stadium. As you walk up the National Park to the stadium, the janitor, will be standing praying to whatever God he believes in that you're Scottish. Because if you're Scottish, he's going to get 20 euros and he's going to show you the ground. Right? And it continues to this day. I mean, the last time I was there was coming up for 2 years ago. My son and I went to the Portuguese Cup final between Porto and Braga, because although as a father and son we'd both been to Lisbon, empty, the Stadio Nacional, the only game it hosts at a higher level is the Portuguese Cup final. So we went there, and it was one of the most moving experiences of my life, because we were sitting in what would be called the Celtic end, and I suddenly realised that I was sitting, if not in the seat, but in the same area as where my grandfather, who on his only trip abroad in his life had sat. So I promptly burst out in tears. I just started crying because of this man that I'd lost when I was 12. I hadn't, when you're 12, you don't have any great connections to people as such. My grandpa was just a sort of hard-working brewery worker. He shifted big tanks of beer and loaded them onto vans. So he came home knackered, wasn't in a mood to sort of converse with young children and all that. Great man, lovely man, but hard. And you said to him, "This is to my forefathers, this is the Great Link, sitting in a bucket seat in the Estadio Nacional." Now that'll be, if you go onto Scottish Twitter, or certainly Celtic Twitter, every day, right, there will be a picture of the Estadio Nacional with Tracy, 14, and her dad, Jimmy, whatever, 32, at the Estadio Nacional. And if you talk to the Jannies at the Estadio Nacional, they'll tell you about how much they love Glasgow and how much they love Glasgow Celtic. Keir Starmer might be cutting international aid, but Glasgow Celtic aid.
Yeah, very, very good way of tying this all together, bringing it back to your grandfather that you mentioned earlier on. Okay, that's the match. 10th of September, 1985, ends up in a draw. Scotland go through to the World Cup, but Wales don't. And, well, there's a lot of tunes, because we always look at the soundtrack of the match, the time of the match that we're talking about, and the soundtrack. There's many tunes in the charts on this day that Welsh football supporters could drown their tears on, because there's one or two real sort of tearjerkers amongst them. But you've had a look at the charts, Hugh. Do you remember this moment, this chart of 1985? Do you remember any of the tunes?
Refresh it a little for me. Refresh it. I'm heading towards 70. Tell me give me the highlights.
Tim, any highlights for you?
I'm gonna try and not have too much of a rant about this, but here we go. It's in an environment which is kind of, it still has the sequels of the Live Aid events, and the number one is Bowie and Jagger with their dreadful version,
shocking,
frankly, of Dancing in the Street. Nothing against either of them, but it's not very good. But I was 20 at this moment, so at 20 you're kicking every ball. These I remember all of it. I remember the ones that really made an impact and the ones that I hated. But I always think that the Live Aid event, and full credit to all the people who were involved, who I think it was a sincere, a beautifully noble, sincere event to attempt to try and do something. But I know its practical consequences have been questioned, because solutions in times like this are always political. They're not charity. And I've just stood aghast through most of it, thinking, because it was organised by people that you thought of as your people, even if you didn't like Geldof's music, which I never did. You think he's like one of us in that, of the whole punk and the post-punk thing. And what do? They bring back every stadium rock dinosaur act. The act that we've spent the last 7 or 8 years saying these acts are irrelevant. They've been partying with Princess Margaret. What's the point of them? And just the thing and it still leaves me aghast thinking of it today. Queen, who had just gone to South Africa. They were on the UN cultural blacklist, and they're given a prime slot. And I remember thinking, this is wrong. This is wrong. But I'm thinking, at least they're not going to do No Time for Losers, because they fucking did it. They did. I couldn't believe it. And it just made me boil with rage, because you'll remember, Hugh, a representative of Her Majesty's Press, all the stuff that, say, Michael Foot would get for allegedly wearing a donkey jacket to the cenotaph. A bollocks story, right? A nonsense story, but, and here a Queen playing singing No Time for Losers, but because we are the champions of the world. The most tasteless remark you could possibly make at an event like this. They're on the UN cultural blacklist, and here they are. For me, it's the moment where that whole post-punk thing, which had gone off in lots of interesting little directions, it's the moment when it dies and the old order come back. When having an event in front of Charles and Di, for crying out loud, could you get the hypocrisy of the British establishment more clearly? And the only thing I liked from the whole event was the Style Council doing I Could Be a King and Steal My People's Things. with a big
No,
smile
no.
on his face, saying there's a message being made there. Because
Yeah,
Lord
absolutely.
knows, you know, there weren't many messages apart from that coming out, apart from kind of bleeding hearted charity, which
Yeah.
always has limitations. It doesn't solve things.
Well, it's all the whole thing is a perfect world where there's no charity. You know, you don't need it.
Right.
You know, because everybody will just be sharing automatically and all this. And it's funny when you're talking about the music of that time, that post-punk is probably ushered in by, in my view, the least sincere proponent of punk, which is Bob Geldof, who to me I was older. I'd be, I'll be 30 then. So punk wasn't my music, but I got it. I got bits of it. I got it.
I think it was much easier for my generation to get because we didn't know what had come before.
Yeah, but
I think that makes all the difference.
Yeah, but you got what music should be about, because you got what, when I was 8 years old and or even younger, and I got the Beatles. I mean, oh my good, even at 8 I knew what was this. Yeah. When I was 10, I got the Stones, because I was talking to this mate the other day. I was saying, we knew at 10 that the Stones were bad boys. As it happens, they were middle class art students from whatever, Essex, and they weren't bad boys at all. Although they did have moments of darkness in their further career, let's say. But that was the thing, and I got the punk reaction, and I got that, but I automatically got that Geldof wasn't part of that. Geldof had hitched his wagon to that.
It's
I don't
true.
think. Yeah, I never.
It's very true. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, that was all I would want to say.
No, you're 100% right at that. Bob Geldof used to play in a kind of a pub rock band in Ireland. They were long-haired hippies, but in 1977, everybody had to cut, all the white folks anyway, had to cut their hair short. All the white male artists had to cut their hair, who were in bands, had to cut their hair short, spike it up a little bit, and wear some sort of Vivienne Westwood outfits. And that's what they did. Got to number one with a tune called Looking After Number One, or Looking Out for Number One. It was an all right hit. It wasn't very, very punky at all, but he had his moment. And you can't blame an artist. And artists do this all the time, because in the music industry, particularly the gatekeepers, they have the sound of the moment ringing in their ear. And what they're looking for, often enough, like football coaches, is somebody who's going to fit into that slot perfectly.
Absolutely.
Not somebody they're going to work on, not somebody that's got its own little thing. When Rihanna blows up, I tell you, if you look at the period that Rihanna dominated the pop charts over the last 10 years, there are so many female singers who sound exactly like her. It's not by chance. It's because that's what the record company wanted. Everybody else who doesn't sound like her. I'm not knocking Rihanna for this.
The A&R men, they just deal with data now.
Well, yeah, they're rubbish. They were rubbish then. Although, no, I did meet one A&R man who knew what he was doing. One A&R man who knew what he was doing.
At least they were trying to follow some kind of intuition. Now they just look at data.
Yeah, or else they just hear what's happening in the rest of the music industry and think, I'll have some of that. There is one genuine punk rocker at this point in these charts, which is Billy Idol, with probably his Billy Idol from Generation X. By this point, he's moved over to the States. He's been living over there for years and years. Like several punks did, most notably John Lydon, Johnny Rotten went over to the States and never came back, because, things were a lot more fun in the States for punk rockers. In a way, America loved our punks long after we had abandoned them. After we'd moved on, they were still loving it there. And White Wedding is one of his best tracks, I've got to say. But it's a different thing. It's at number 20 in the charts, going down. But it's a different thing from the stuff that he would have done with likes of Brian James, who was a guitarist with Generation X at the time.
But you can only do that for so long. You got to take it somewhere. There has to be an evolution.
Well, this is the point, Tim. This is exactly the point I'm trying to make about your, it was a impressive slap down of stadium rockers and the old timers, but
stadium rock is what the whole punk thing was against.
Yeah, but it was. But then we all grow up, don't we? And we suddenly realize, well, hang on a second, music is music.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah,
I'm
I haven't
planting my
grown
flag
up.
right here, Peter Pan.
Yeah, okay, good for you. But eventually, with evolution, you get to understand that music is music. You know, you write songs as a punk rocker, but really what you want to write songs about is subjects that everybody's going to be engaged
But
in.
how about, as an example of how to do it, Madness, Yesterday's Men.
Yeah,
Just
they're in there.
the beautiful, wistful melancholy of age. It's fantastically done.
Better than that. He's not in the charts, but Captain Sensible's Happy
Happy Days, yeah.
No, it wasn't Happy
Talk.
Days. Happy Talk.
Happy Talk.
I mean, that was as far away from anything that the Damned had ever done. But he got the message. It was a hit first time around, and there is something magical about that song. And you evolve. And at this point, you're absolutely right.
I love his what? You know, the US have invented rap, and what the British going to do? We're going to take the piss out of it.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
Captain, I said, what? You know, it's absolutely brilliant. Great record.
But
British
what
genius
is
taking a piss out of things.
And you're absolutely right about the politics of Live Aid, but everything is of its time. You remember the Michael Burke, and he's not my favorite journalist, by the way, but nevertheless, the Michael Burke documentary from Ethiopia, news documentary, was so evocative. It was emotional for people. It wasn't like, you know, black people were saying, "Oh, I'm not happy about this. They haven't got any black people on Live Aid or on Band Aid," as they initially didn't have. They brought some Americans on. It had no black British contributions on the initial Band Aid. Live Aid, they thought, okay, let's bring in a few. Again, they had to almost stretch left and right for African Americans to fill those slots. But we were also emotionally caught up in it. That there aren't many people who were around at that time that didn't contribute towards the fund. Yeah, exactly, for Ethiopia. And then in retrospect, now we look back and think, not least through the intervention of, you know, like Ed Sheeran, but we look back and think, maybe it wasn't a good look. But what I was going to say, I remember this period just before this. There was a period from about 1980 to 1983 when Bob Geldof was scratching around, not knowing what to do next. I went down to Dennis Bovell, had a Studio 80, which was just on the south side of the river in Southwark Bridge. I walked in there one day, it would have been about 1980, thereabout, and Bob Geldof was sitting in the studio space, the recording space, with the guitar, trying to come up with a hit. So there were many years between looking out for number one or looking after number one to between that, which was 77, I seem to remember, and Live Aid, which was 83 ultimately, or Band Aid, which was 83. Yeah. But Band Aid was 84. Yeah,
it was Christmas 84 going into 85.
Yeah, exactly. So there were many years between that Bob Geldof was scratching around trying to get a hit, you know, probably 4 or 5 years at least between that. And what he realized along the way was, hang on a second, I can do this instead. You know, when after the Michael Burke video came out, and he did do a good job. He did do, you know, if you look at trying to start up a charity from scratch, coming up with the idea that lots of musicians can contribute to this. It was like the concert for Bangladesh. You know, there hadn't been many of these type of things at the time. There hadn't been many of these things. And you've got to give the guy credit. You might look back on the concert for Bangladesh now and think, well, George Harrison, was that a mistake or what?
I think it was a noble attempt.
Yeah. So I find it difficult to diss Live Aid, but what came as a result, I think, was probably, you're right, it was a reassertment of the hold of the music industry in big power, in power. Yeah. That's what the music.
That's what they want. They want stadium rock acts because they can make more money off stadium rock acts.
But Dire Straits' "Money for Nothing" isn't that a brilliant track at number 14?
Dreadful. Okay. I quite like the first album. That. You know, I like the Sultans of Swing and all the rest of it.
Dreadful. Come on, man.
It's dreadful.
Do you know, it's ironic.
You package what they've got to the American Midwest. It's dreadful.
You talk about British irony in, you know, Americans Got Rap. Well, here, they're taking the piss out of rock bands, the very bands that you're talking about, the big stadium rockers. They say, I've got a blister on my finger. You know, that's the rock artists that they're talking about. It's not them taking the mickey out of it.
It is funny. I just would
rather not listen
to it.
The one dodgy word makes it difficult to play on the radio nowadays without that being bleeped out. I think they learned that American colloquialisms for gay men may not be appropriate to use as a throwaway thing on a record. At number 9, say I'm your number 1. Let me just talk about this very briefly.
Yes,
Princess.
I remember her.
This was the very first hit for Stock Aitken and Waterman. I remember going to, this was their very first hit. I remember going to their studio. They had a studio just south of London Bridge, thereabouts, Sanctuary Road or the Sanctuary Studios, I seem to remember. And I was interviewing this young woman called Princess. I didn't know who these Stock Aitken and Waterman guys were, but I thought, you know, Princess, this is a nice little tune and everything. And it was the one that helped them on the trajectory of success. But what happened very quickly is that Princess complained, to me at least, that there was some existential prejudice within the music industry because she was very dark-skinned, but on the posters for her first album, you'd have thought she was Beyonce. She was so light. They'd lighten it up so much. But then, of course, if you got Kylie Minogue coming over from Australia, you can dump Princess and move on without those issues. But the Princess hit shows you that Stock Aitken and Waterman started off as a soul combo of songwriters.
Do you remember that record that they did called Roadblock?
Roadblock. I was just about to come to that. Give me time. I'm coming to China and Roadblock. Yeah,
it's brilliant.
Of course, it's probably the best slice of British disco, I would call it, that's ever been made. And all she sang was Roadblock, Roadblock. That's what she sang. She didn't have to go beyond that.
It's got a nice early 70s groove about it. It's not a bad time, I think, for dance music. I mean, D-Train, you're the one for me. For me, it's one of the all-time greats. Maybe it's because I was 20 and I was out dancing to it a lot, you know. But I think it's just an amazing, amazing record.
Don't Stop the Dance, Brian Ferry at number 21.
Yeah,
Pretty good.
Time for it.
Holiday by Madonna. You know, I wasn't a Madonna fan, but looking back on that.
That's the second time around. I think her big record at that time was Get Into the Groove, which is
of course it was.
Much more tinny disco.
Yeah, although I liked
Lisa from Cult Jam, Full Force. Yeah. I Wonder If I Take You Home. That was a great record as well.
I didn't enjoy that as much as I enjoyed listening to Tina Turner's "We Don't Need Another Hero" again. I know you're gonna. I knew you would say that. I'm just anticipating what you're about to say. Look, it's not the Tina Turner that you want to talk about, but Tim, she's evolved. She's now the biggest black female artist, the only one in rock music. She's going to fill stadiums, and her big hits are going to be torch songs like "We Don't Need Another Hero," "Welcome to the Thunderdome," is what I can tell you.
Yeah, just because someone's invented something doesn't mean I have to like it. I don't have to be down with every little bit of human evolution. And I'm sure Hugh will back me up on this.
Well, in terms of Jock Stein, he invented this new revolutionary style of football that you're talking about. So be careful how you answer that.
Well, funny enough, it's very funny. Like Tina Turner's a great one to talk about in Scotland. It shows you little micro systems in Scotland. I once talked to Gordon Byrne, the great writer. Wrote a great novel. Arnold Cogan wrote a fantastic book about the Yorkshire Ripper. One of the great writers. Died tragically young, and I was a book event for him, and he was a Sunderland supporter, and he was making the case to me that Sunderland v Newcastle would be as tasty as Celtic v Rangers. And I said to him, well, there's people in Glasgow who won't talk to their grandchildren because they married somebody on the other side of the divide, honestly. I said, but there'll be Tina Turner, I said, will not be played at a Celtic wedding. I said, if I hear Tina Turner, I know I'm not at a Celtic wedding. And he went, what? No. He said, I won't. Because Tina Turner, of course, sang Simply the Best, which is Rangers adopted as their anthem, right? Okay. And they play it before every game. So there's no way, as a Celtic fan or a Celtic supporter, you are going to have anything, even going back to the great Ike days of Tina Turner, because that'll label you. You'd be more likely to get the Pogues.
Dirty Old Town, Dirty Old Town. Is it number 66?
Yeah, I mean, it's the Pogues would be, a Celtic staple if you're making, we'd be in it. Of course, the Dirty Old Town. I think that was Ewan. Was it Ewan McCall wrote that?
It was.
But it was picked up.
Salford.
And do you know that Jimmy Johnston? If you go down YouTube holes, Jimmy Johnston and I'm not sure if it was Shane McGowan. Are probably more likely to be with Simply Minds and Jim Kerr. There's stuff of Jimmy Johnston singing Dirty Old Town, which is and it has got a line in it which says, I saw Jimmy Johnston sparkle on the wing or something like that. And Jimmy sings that with Jim Kerr. So that's so I brought all this talk right back round to Jimmy Johnston and Celtic through the Pogues and Tina Turner.
Right, and you don't forget your granddad as well. It's been absolutely amazing, Hugh. I don't know why we don't have you on the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast more often, but yeah, welcome back anytime. It's been amazing talking about the great Jock Stein and the last game that he sadly, tragically coached, Scotland against Wales at Ninian Park, 1-1 draw. Well worth talking about, the 10th of September 1985. Yeah, let's do this again.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got to do it with Scotland, Uruguay. When Uruguay get a man sent off after 10 seconds, just so we can listen to the Ian St John rant and the frustration at the end.
And Scotland and the great Ernie Walker of Scotland describing these opponents as animals as well. At the end, the SFA president describing the opponents as animals. And I think the 1986 Scotland in 1986 World. I can air my theory in that, Tim, as well, that if Maradona was Scottish, we'd have won the World Cup that year. Never mind.
Of course you would have. Stages. Yeah, if he was Nigerian, we'd have won the World Cup.
Exactly. People forget just how good he was.
Exactly. Thank you very much, both of you.